You don't forget the sound of chains scraping fiberglass at 7 a.m. It doesn't matter if you were born in war or suburbia, there's something ancient and instinctual about it, like a predator dragging prey back to its den. That morning, I stood barefoot on my dock, coffee in hand, and watched my 2 kayaks hang from the hooks of a tow truck like contraband seized in some dystopian lakeside raid. Diesel fumes curled through the fog as the truck reversed down the ramp, the operator avoiding my eyes with the practiced awkwardness of someone who was just following orders. And there she was, Karen Bloom, standing 15 feet away with a clipboard and a cucumber water, wearing a neon sash that read Lake Enforcement Volunteer like she had knighted herself overnight. That's when I knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was war. I didn't shout. I didn't move. I just sipped the last of my coffee and watched them go, my kayaks, orange and bright in mine, vanishing like truth in a board meeting. You might think this started with the kayaks, but it didn't. It started the day I ignored the first flyer taped to my mailbox. Friendly reminder, aesthetic cohesion is a shared responsibility. I crumpled it and fed it to the fire pit. That was my first mistake. You can't feed fire to people like Karen and expect them to back off. You have to starve them of attention or drown them in their own contradictions. I did neither. I underestimated her. My name is Eli. I live in Silverthorne Cove. Not just live, this lake is more than a home, it's a lineage. I inherited this patch of water and surrounding land from my grandfather, a quiet man who didn't believe in fences, permits, or laminated community values. He believed in nature's rhythm and in our job to protect it, not micromanage it. He fought off developers in the 80s who wanted to drain the lake and turn the shoreline into a golf course. His counteroffer? A private co-management agreement with the state, one that granted our family ecological authority over the lake's health, sediment testing, species restoration, floodgate maintenance. To most, it was paperwork. To me, it was scripture. For 30 years, Silverthorne stayed quiet. Fishermen cast in the early mist. Kids dove from creaky docks. Walter, a retired Marine with a prosthetic leg, used my kayaks for therapy, gliding across the water like he was being stitched back together. It was peace. Until the development. They called it Silverthorne South, but it may as well have been called HOA-topia. The houses were identical, like someone photocopied a Pinterest board and called it luxury. And with them came the documents, the dues, the declarations, and the people who thought peace needed rules to exist. 6 months in, Karen was voted president of the HOA. 7 months in, she created a lake use committee. She appointed herself chairwoman. And then she appointed Ron and Sheila, who dressed like they'd been selected in a golf tournament raffle, as her enforcers. They patrolled the walking trails with clipboards and rulebooks, measuring paddle lengths, weighing fishing lines, checking flotation devices for non-compliance. At first, I thought it was a joke. I'd sip bourbon from my porch and watch Ron try to issue a citation to a 10-year-old for riding a flamingo floaty shaped like a donut. But it wasn't a joke. Not to them. Then came the signs. No private kayaks. No unauthorized vessels. No dock access without HOA permit. I ripped down the one posted on my dock. 2 days later, another one reappeared, laminated. They were relentless in the most passive-aggressive way possible. And then the kayaks vanished. Not drifted. Not borrowed. Stolen, by the HOA, or at least its weaponized bureaucracy. I checked the security camera feed. A contractor in an HOA-issued vest came just after dawn, unhooked the kayaks from my private dock, loaded them onto a trailer, and drove away. No notice. No knock. No ticket. Just gone. It wasn't enforcement. It was a statement. You may think this is your lake, but we make the rules now. I drove to the HOA office. It was decorated like a wellness spa for control freaks. Eucalyptus diffusers, soft jazz, furniture that whispered, "We don't argue here, we reframe conflicts." Karen sat behind a frosted glass desk under a plaque that read Community Peace Coordinator. I told her flatly that my kayaks had been stolen. She smiled, like really smiled, the kind that stretches across a person's face when they think they've won something. Then she handed me a laminated pamphlet with the lake regulations, highlighting Section 19, subsection C. "Your vessels were unregistered and visually non-compliant with approved aesthetics," she said. "I never signed this," I replied. "You didn't need to," she chirped. "By residing in Silverthorne Cove, you're automatically under HOA jurisdiction for all shared-use resources, including, but not limited to, the lake." "I own the dock," I said. "The water touches it," she said, sipping her cucumber water like it was communion. "Which makes it communal." She didn't see it. She didn't see the shift. She didn't hear the storm begin in my silence. I left without a word. No threat. No raised voice. Just a look. And in that look, I think something finally clicked for her, that maybe she'd pushed the wrong person. Not because I was angry. Because I wasn't. Because I was calm. Because calm is the face of someone holding power they haven't used yet. Back at my cabin, I pulled out a key I hadn't touched in years. It belonged to a shed most people didn't even notice, hidden behind the reeds and disguised like a tool closet. But beneath it was the lake's old soul, a valve system built by my grandfather, connected to the outflow tunnels that regulate water levels for drought control and maintenance. That night, I opened the file, Conservation Agreement #479, and reread every clause, every provision. It was all still valid, still legal, still mine. I called Lupe. She's not just my lawyer. She's my friend, my co-conspirator, and one of the few people who doesn't laugh when I say the word stewardship. When I told her what happened, she didn't even pause. "Looks like it's time," she said. "Let's remind them who the lake really listens to." That was the first night I didn't sleep, not from rage but from clarity. It wasn't revenge. Not really. It was a reset. You can't scream someone into sanity. You have to show them the cost of their delusions. The next morning, while most of the HOA was still asleep in coordinated bathrobes, I filed a formal notice of ecological maintenance with the county and water board. Lupe had already prepped the documentation. It referenced our conservation rights and required, by law, the suspension of recreational activity during the drawdown period. I wasn't emptying the lake. I was breathing it. By noon, the first pump regulator was installed. The hum of the motor echoed across the surface like a heartbeat, low, steady, inevitable. And as the lake began to recede, inch by quiet inch, I placed a small wooden sign near the walking trail. Ecological maintenance in progress. Water levels subject to change. No threats. No names. Just truth. I walked back to the cabin, poured myself another coffee, and watched the ripples fold back into silence. They thought they had taken something from me. What they didn't know is that they'd given me permission. Permission to let the lake speak. And the lake was just getting started. By the time the first brunch crew noticed the waterline receding, the lake had already dropped nearly 4 inches. It was subtle, almost respectful, like nature whispering instead of screaming. But for a place where ego floated just beneath the surface, subtle was enough to start a panic. A paddle boat nudged the mud, then scraped. A pontoon bobbed crooked, groaning under its own weight. From my porch, I watched it all unfold with the quiet focus of someone not waiting for chaos, but documenting its pattern. That morning, I took out my grandfather's old journal and began logging the drawdown. Water levels, sediment patterns, species exposure. I wrote not like someone making a statement, but like a scientist restoring order to something that had been screaming in silence. Around 10 a.m., Lupe called to confirm the county had acknowledged the maintenance notice. Not only was it processed, but it had been shared across departments, water conservation, wildlife, even parks and recreation. The formality wasn't just a box checked, it was a spotlight, one that shone directly onto the HOA's fantasy marina plan. I didn't need to challenge them. I only had to let their imagination collapse under the weight of reality. Around noon, the first confrontation came. Ron, sweat already soaking through his tight golf shirt, stomped down the trail toward the valve shed, eyes darting like a man looking for a fire he didn't know how to put out. He spotted the sign first, ecological maintenance in progress. Water levels subject to change. Then he saw the second one beneath it, printed on county letterhead, with the seal and my name clearly visible. His mouth moved before his brain did. "You can't just drain the lake," he snapped. I offered him lemonade. He didn't take it. "You're violating community trust," he added, voice wavering with bureaucratic indignation. "CaryNet hasn't approved any of this." I pointed to the QR code on the sign. "Scan that," I said. He did. And as the permit loaded on his screen, I watched the stages of grief unfold on his face: denial, confusion, acceptance, and finally fear. Not fear of me. Fear of being exposed as someone who didn't know what the hell he was enforcing. He walked away without saying a word. That evening, the lake dropped another inch. Not much, but enough to expose the undersides of the HOA's floating brunch platform. Those ridiculous barrels lashed together with zip ties and hope. Without water to keep it level, it listed like a drunk cruise ship. Sheila showed up mid-afternoon with a pool skimmer and a megaphone, trying to rally volunteers to rescue the chairs that had slipped into the shallows. Nobody came. She kicked at the water in frustration and got a face full of mud spray for her effort. Meanwhile, I kept working, installing bypass channels, redirecting flow, monitoring aquatic pressure like it was my pulse. I wasn't trying to be poetic, but the irony kept writing itself. The lake, once their status symbol, was becoming their reflection, shallow, unstable, and utterly exposed. The following day brought a new escalation. Flyers appeared around the neighborhood, warning residents of unauthorized ecological tampering. They didn't mention me by name, but the subtext was clear. I was the villain draining their backyard dreams. In response, I added a third sign, this one stating the exact conservation clause being executed and referencing the co-management agreement grandfathered into the state's records. I knew they wouldn't read it. It wasn't for them. It was for everyone else. That night, a kid on a scooter yelled "water thief" as he passed my driveway. He lost control, crashed into a bush, and I helped him up. He didn't look afraid, just curious. "Do you really control the whole lake?" he asked. "Not the whole thing," I replied, brushing dirt from his elbow. "Just the part that breathes." On the third day, I woke up to the sound of voices, angry, layered, unprepared for the silence that surrounded them. The HOA had called an emergency meeting beneath the gazebo. I stayed inside, but I could hear everything through their brand new speaker system. They'd installed it to announce community brunches. Now it was broadcasting their unraveling. "This is sabotage," Carrynet barked. "It's an environmental attack." Ron tried to interject, waving a copy of the permit, but she snatched it from his hand like it was evidence of betrayal. "This is a conspiracy," she said. "He's working with the county to undermine our governance." "You mean following the law?" someone muttered in the back. Sheila tried to blame the fish, said maybe the ecosystem was overcorrecting itself. When Carrynet finally read the full document, she fell silent. 10 full seconds of silence, broken only by the sound of a chair creaking beneath her sudden stillness. Then she slammed the clipboard down and stormed off, sash fluttering like a dethroned monarch. Later that day, a new notice went up by the HOA office. "Caution. Unauthorized lake maintenance may be occurring. Residents are advised to avoid all pump equipment." I couldn't resist. I added another sheet below it, laminated, official, with a barcode link to the filed permit and a bold disclaimer. "Work approved under State Conservation Agreement #479A. They called it tampering. The law called it stewardship. And the water, well, the water didn't care what they called it. It only moved when asked correctly. The following morning, I received a message from Lupe. Someone had tipped off the local news. A crew was on its way. She asked if I wanted to make a statement. I declined. I wasn't interested in defending truth to people who had mistaken comfort for law. But I did prep the site, cleaned up the equipment, made sure the flow regulators looked tidy, and planted a native wildflower bed along the receding bank. If they were going to film anything, I wanted them to capture the lake's healing, not its suffering. When the news van arrived, I watched from a distance. The reporter was young, well-intentioned, clearly trying to balance the absurdity of the situation with the gravity of the setting. She interviewed Sheila first, who claimed I had murdered their summer. Then she caught Ron pacing in front of the gazebo, reading parts of the permit aloud like someone trying to pass a class he'd never studied for. But the real comedy came from the background, a shot of the lake reduced to a cracked reflection of its former self, with jet skis marooned on dry sediment and lawn chairs sunk like forgotten ambitions. That night, the footage aired under the headline, "Lake War, HOA versus the man with the valve." Social media did what it always does, spun the chaos into legend. Memes bloomed. A split-screen photo of my kayaks being towed beside a picture of Carrynet flailing in ankle-deep water became the new neighborhood wallpaper. The caption read, "From kayak to crisis in 3 HOA meetings." The attention should have rattled me. Instead, it gave me clarity. They wanted power. What they got was attention. And attention doesn't play by committee rules. On the 4th morning, I found tire tracks near the valve shed. Someone had tried to approach the equipment overnight. I checked the trail camera. Sure enough, Carrynet herself, dressed like a spy from a suburban soap opera, had attempted to shut off one of the auxiliary valves. She slipped, fell face first into the mud, and limped away with her sash soaked and ego broken. I forwarded the footage to Lupe, who filed a formal report for attempted interference with protected infrastructure. The state responded with a warning to the HOA. Further interference would result in legal sanctions. I didn't press charges. I didn't need to. The footage leaked online anyway, set to slow-motion piano music and dubbed Operation Mud Queen. By the 5th day, things were unraveling faster than the waterline. A petition emerged, signed by over 30 residents, demanding a review of HOA leadership. An anonymous flyer was taped to every mailbox. "Respect the lake, not the laminate." And in the middle of it all, the lake kept receding, revealing silt formations, invasive snail clusters, and erosion trails left behind by overuse and artificial wake. I documented every inch. Not to prove a point. To finish what my grandfather started. Not preservation. Restoration. This wasn't revenge. This was repair. And Silverthorne was finally breathing. The 6th morning began with a knock. Not from a neighbor, not from the HOA, but from a man in a navy windbreaker with the county seal stitched above his chest pocket. His name was Theo, a field investigator from the Environmental Compliance Division. He wasn't there to ask questions. He was there to verify. He had the permit in one hand and a drone controller in the other. "This one's drawing attention up the chain," he said plainly, nodding toward the lake. I offered him a coffee and gave him access to the maintenance records, my logs, the conservation agreement, everything. He didn't blink. Just scanned the documents like a man used to seeing them abused, forged, or ignored. "You're the first one I've seen in a while who files reports before taking action," he said, mostly to himself. For the next 3 hours, Theo launched his drone, took readings, collected soil samples, and asked a steady stream of technical questions. He wasn't there to judge the HOA's drama. He was there for the truth beneath the mud. When he left, he shook my hand. "You're doing the right thing, Eli," he said. "Keep going." That was the first time I allowed myself to feel something close to vindication. Not pride, not triumph, just the deep, quiet knowing that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one paying attention. By noon, the waterline had dropped to a critical depth. Exposed roots clawed from the soil like the skeletal remains of bad landscaping choices. The floating brunch patio was now a grounded mess of barrels, splintered decking, and tangled streamers from their last lakefront mimosa morning. I documented it all, angle by angle, timestamp by timestamp. Lupe told me it was gold. "If this ever goes to court," she said, "we won't just win. We'll make case study history." The HOA, on the other hand, was splintering like their patio. Sheila resigned from her role as Lakeview's co-coordinator via a printed note taped to the clubhouse door. Ron stopped speaking entirely, just roamed the neighborhood with a clipboard and an existential stare. "And Karen?" She doubled down. That afternoon, I received an official envelope containing a temporary restraining order. The allegations were almost operatic. Ecological terrorism, deliberate disruption of protected species habitats, weaponized flooding architecture. Lupe read the document over the phone while wheezing from laughter. She used the phrase aqua warfare, Eli. Aqua warfare. We filed a counter-motion the same day, complete with drone footage showing the HOA's unpermitted construction efforts from months earlier. Bulldozers near the shoreline, gravel being dumped into the water, massive concrete blocks placed without regulation. The court date was set within the week. Meanwhile, the HOA held a town hall. This time it wasn't under the gazebo, but in the community gymnasium, as if larger walls would contain the collapse. Flyers were slid into mailboxes overnight with the bold, panicked headline, "Save our shoreline." I didn't attend, but I listened from a distance, hidden beneath the overhang of the equipment shed. Karen's voice was unmistakable, sharp, theatrical, trembling with manufactured urgency. "He's draining our lake for revenge," she declared. "He's exploiting obscure loopholes to destroy our property values." A murmur of confusion swept the room. Someone asked why they hadn't been informed about the HOA's earlier construction projects. Another voice asked who paid for the floating patio. Someone else asked why HOA dues had increased twice in the last year. The temperature shifted. I could feel it like barometric pressure. Then Ron, of all people, stood up and read, out loud, the clause from the conservation agreement that gave me oversight. He ended his short speech with the most honest line of the evening. "I think we got carried away." I didn't know whether to thank him or mourn the time it took. That night, a local news van parked near the trailhead. The young reporter, Drew, returned, this time with boots and a notepad. He interviewed residents standing ankle-deep in cracked soil and dislodged patio furniture. One woman said it looked like God pressed pause on the lake. Another called it performance art. When Drew asked me for a statement, I gave him a quote he wasn't expecting. "This isn't about kayaks," I said. "It's about remembering that water doesn't bend to ego. It evaporates." The clip aired that night and sparked what can only be described as a cultural moment. Memes exploded again. A side-by-side of Karen's HOA sash and her mud-soaked fall went viral. Someone set the footage to orchestral music and uploaded it as HOA, the musical Act 2 Descent. Teenagers started a TikTok trend called Silverthorn Slide, imitating Karen's spill using lawn sprinklers and homemade sashes. But beneath the comedy was something else. Questions. People started asking why so many HOA rules were created without consensus. Why enforcement looked more like harassment. Why a lake had to look like a catalog instead of a living thing. And then came the hearing. The courtroom was modest, pale walls, buzzing fluorescents, and the kind of government-issued chairs designed to discourage comfort or rebellion. Karen had arrived with a binder thicker than a Bible and a temper that barely fit in her shoes. She brought Ron, who looked like a ghost in khakis, and Sheila, who kept her sunglasses on indoors. Lupe strolled in with a USB drive and a folder half the size of theirs. The judge was a woman in her 50s with a dry voice and a low tolerance for drama. After 20 minutes of procedural build-up, Lupe played the drone footage. There it was, unpermitted dredging, unauthorized concrete blocks, wildlife scattering from machinery. Karen had objected. "This is manipulated media," she shouted. The judge lowered her glasses. "Do you have any permits for the construction shown?" Silence. "Then sit down," the judge said. The restraining order was dismissed immediately. But it didn't end there. The judge filed a motion to open an investigation into the HOA for violations of environmental law and misuse of community funds. Karen's face went from red to gray. Ron rubbed his temples like he was massaging a headache made of regret. Sheila finally spoke. Can I get a copy of that footage? The next day, the Silverthorne Facebook group exploded. The headline on the community forum read, HOA faces legal probe over lake mismanagement. Comment sections became confessionals. Residents who once enforced kayak weight limits began posting photos of the lake as it dried, calling it civic karma. One man wore a shirt that said, I came for the brunch, stayed for the revolution. Another staged a mud yoga session near the exposed dock. And in the midst of it all, I kept working. Not out of spite, not even out of duty, but because the lake deserved to be clean, whole, and understood. My grandfather used to say that stewardship isn't loud, it's long. By the end of the week, the water had dropped to its lowest sanctioned level. I logged the sediment exposure. I mapped the invasive snail colonies. I photographed erosion scars and compiled them into a folder titled Lessons. And on the 7th day, I stood at the edge of what once shimmered and now whispered. A few frogs croaked from puddles. Herons stalked the mud for fish too slow to escape. The air was quiet, not empty but waiting. Behind me someone approached. Walter, the Marine. The man who once used the orange kayak for therapy. He said nothing, just nodded toward the cracked earth and the glint of sun on shallow pools. Then he looked at me and said, I think she's breathing again. I nodded. So was I. The return didn't begin with fanfare. It began with dew. Cold, silent, clinging to the exposed reeds like the lake was exhaling after a long, choked breath. I stood outside the valve shed before sunrise, the conservation report finalized in my pocket, my fingers on the switch that would reverse everything, not in a dramatic flood, but in a slow reclamation. There's something sacred about restoring what you dismantled, not for applause, not for proof, but because the cycle demands it. The gate creaked. The system hissed. And then, like a muscle remembering how to flex, the first trickle of water re-entered Silverthorne Cove. No spectators, no drone footage, just gravity doing what it was designed to do. I stayed for hours, monitoring the flow, adjusting regulators with the precision my grandfather once taught me. Every half hour, I took a photo, not for social media, but for the file. For the record. For whoever would come next. That afternoon, the first person to notice wasn't an adult. It was a girl, maybe 8, barefoot, hair like dried hay, walking the shoreline with a stick she used like a magic wand. She saw the puddles growing, her reflection expanding across the mud, and yelled back to someone out of sight, It's coming back! That was how the word spread. Not through HOA memos or petitions or news alerts. Through barefoot wonder. By evening, several families had wandered down to the edge, cautiously optimistic, like they were visiting a patient recovering from surgery. No one said anything formal. They just watched. Water crawled over the cracked earth in silent inches, swallowing old footprints, reclaiming its curves. Even the birds changed pitch, less frantic, more curious. That night, I sat on my porch with a lantern and a notebook. My grandfather's handwriting lined the margins of an old page, notes from a time the lake had dropped during drought, and he'd been tasked with managing its return. His advice was simple: let nature finish the sentence you started. So I waited. Every morning, I'd return to the shed, check levels, clean filters, and release a little more. Each afternoon brought new visitors: an old man with a folding chair and a fishing pole that hadn't touched water in years, a couple who used to kayak before Karenit's regime turned joy into paperwork, kids chasing frogs through the shallows. Nobody mentioned the HOA. Not anymore. They talked about the sound of water against the dock, about the color returning to the lily pads, about how the wind smelled different now, softer. On the 3rd morning of restoration, I woke to find a group of teenagers painting a wooden sign near the entrance to the trail. It read in thick blue letters, Welcome back, Silverthorne. Beneath that, in smaller print, someone had written, Respect the water. Respect each other. No brunch barges without permission. I didn't paint it. I didn't authorize it. But I left it alone. Because it was perfect. Later that day, a man named Greg knocked on my door. He wore large glasses, khaki shorts, and carried a clipboard that looked more like a grocery list than a declaration. We're forming a temporary committee, he said, to transition the HOA into something less dramatic. I offered him a chair. We sat under the shade of the pine trees, just talking. He wasn't a crusader. He wasn't looking for power. He was a retired librarian who believed in common sense and quiet. The kind of man who described his leadership style as low volume and high snacks. We'd like to set up a shared stewardship model, he said, based on the conservation agreement. Not control. Balance. I nodded. Good, I said. Because the lake doesn't need governance. It needs room. We shook hands over lemonade in silence. The kind of handshake that didn't bind people to rules but to respect. Over the next few days, I watched the lake complete itself. Not in a rush. Not in a cinematic swell. But in layers. The shallow ends refilled first, lifting algae and abandoned toys to the surface. Then the middle swelled, inching up to docks like a dog returning home after being kicked out. Fish reappeared, where from, no one knew, but they darted between reeds like they'd been waiting. Frogs croaked louder. Birds nested again. At one point, someone played a trumpet near the water's edge. It was off-key but earnest. They called it the Lake Rebirth Anthem. I didn't stop them. Why would I? We'd all been too quiet for too long. On the 5th day, I tied 2 new kayaks to the dock. They were gifts. Not for me. For Walter, the retired Marine who once used mine before they were towed like contraband. He arrived with his daughter and grandkids, all in matching life vests. One of the kids carried a plastic duck float. Walter didn't speak much. He didn't need to. He just nodded, placed a hand on my shoulder, and took to the water like a man returning to something more than a hobby. His silhouette against the golden hour was the kind of image you frame without ever taking a photo. More people came. Some I hadn't seen in months. Former HOA loyalists who used to glare at me now brought pies and folding chairs. One woman apologized without words by handing me a peach cobbler and asking if I liked card games. Another neighbor, once obsessed with paddleboat reservations, offered to help clean up debris. No committees, she said, smiling sheepishly. Just hands. For the first time since this began, the conversations were not about violations or regulations. They were about fishing spots, about childhood memories, about which birds had returned. Someone started a fire pit near the old picnic area. Music played. Nobody argued over volume. It felt like the lake had dragged something deeper back with it, community. And the best part, there was no agenda, no minutes, no quorum, just people remembering how to share something that never needed to be divided. That night, as the stars reflected over water that had once been mud, I sat at the end of my dock. Not to monitor or measure, just to sit. The valve shed behind me stood silent, its job done. The lake was full, but not just of water, of clarity, of stories, of mistakes that had finally run their course. Across the cove, laughter echoed softly. A dog barked. A guitar strummed something vaguely familiar. And beneath it all, the rhythm of water lapping would like a lullaby older than any rulebook. I thought about everything it took to get here, the theft, the tension, the hearings, the memes, the mud. All of it absurd. All of it necessary. Because sometimes you don't win by shouting louder. You win by outlasting the noise. 1 week after restoration, the new committee, if it could even be called that, held a gathering in Greg's garage. No badges. No sashes. Just lemonade, cookies, and a handwritten note on a dry erase board that read, "What does the lake need?" Nobody said power. Nobody said policy. They said benches, trash bins, native plants, birdhouses, and less concrete. Always less concrete. Greg ended the meeting with a question. Do we need a flag? Someone suggested a wind chime instead. Everyone agreed. As the group dispersed, I walked back to the dock. A family I'd never met before was there. Their child dipped a net into the water, lifting out tiny minnows and gasping in delight. The father apologized for intruding. I waved him off. If you're here for the water, I said, you're exactly where you belong. And as the sun lowered once more, painting silverthorn in hues of fire and forgiveness, I knew something had changed, not just around the lake, but inside the people who had almost lost it. And maybe inside me too. Not everything has to be drained to be understood. But sometimes letting go is the only way to see what was worth keeping. Spring arrived with the sound of wind through full reeds and the quiet crackle of new growth beneath pine needles. The lake was back. Not the same as before, cleaner in some places, messier in others, but alive, fully, without apology. The birds had resumed their arguments at sunrise. The frogs held nightly concerts from the shallows. The docks creaked under the weight of kids with fishing rods and old men who hadn't smiled this wide in years. I spent most mornings walking the trail around the water's edge, logging new observations, noting where erosion still threatened the bank, where native plants had returned on their own like prodigal children. The sediment map was almost complete. The wildlife logbook had more entries in the last 2 weeks than in the past 2 years. Restoration wasn't just something we finished, it was something we had joined. And yet, in the midst of all this renewal, the ghost of the old HOA still lingered like smoke after a burned-out fire. Karen was gone. Officially, she resigned. Unofficially, she packed a moving truck in the dead of night after the video of her midnight valve sabotage reached over 1 million views online. The segment was played on a late-night show. The host called her the aquatic vigilante of HOA justice, before cutting to slow-motion footage of her falling face-first into a puddle, set to dramatic opera. Rumor had it she tried to sue 3 neighbors for defamation. No lawyer took the case. One story said she moved to a gated community 3 towns over where drones were banned and lawn colors had to be HOA approved. Another claimed she took a job as a compliance consultant. I didn't care. She was no longer part of the water. That was enough. Her absence left a vacuum, but not the kind that needed to be filled with power. The interim committee had quietly dissolved itself, transitioning into what Greg, with his librarian calm, called a loosely structured lake affinity group. No titles, no motions, just a shared drive folder and occasional meetings with lemonade and folding chairs. They handled requests like dock repair coordination and trash pickup scheduling. The only rule, unspoken but universally observed, was simple: no more sashes. It had become a joke among the residents. At one of the trail markers, someone installed a wooden plaque that read "Sash-Free Zone." I added a small sketch of a kayak underneath. Tourists started showing up again. Not in droves, not yet, but enough to make the local ice cream shop extend its weekend hours. A few curious faces walked the loop trail, camera phones in hand, asking if this was the place where the HOA lady got mud-slapped by karma. I never confirmed it. I just pointed them toward the public notice board and let the signs speak for themselves. One said, "Ecological maintenance complete." Another said, "Be kind to water." And the newest one, scrawled in childlike handwriting on laminated poster board, read, "Don't boss the lake." A month after the restoration, I started a blog. Not for therapy, for memory. It was called Maintenance Mode. I uploaded photos, notes, journal entries from my grandfather, scanned copies of the conservation agreement, and a few stories from neighbors who wanted their side of Silverthorne told. I kept the tone dry but curious, equal parts science and quiet sarcasm. It found an audience. A small one at first, mostly folks dealing with their own HOA nightmares. Then the emails started coming in, people asking how to defend a community garden from regulation, how to challenge fines over rain barrels, how to coexist with rules without letting them replace reason. I didn't give legal advice. That was Lupe's department. I gave stories. One reader in Oregon wrote, "You reminded me that places aren't meant to be managed, they're meant to be respected." That was the comment I printed and pinned above my workbench. Walter, the Marine, became a fixture again. He brought coffee in the mornings, sat quietly on the dock most afternoons, and sometimes helped me plant cattails along the shallow edges. His new kayak bore a decal that read Lake Veteran. His grandkids visited every other weekend. They brought a plastic duck they insisted was the lake's official mascot. Greg approved it with a sticky note that read "Quack ratified." And just like that, it became tradition. One afternoon, as we packed up debris from the final restoration zone, Greg looked out over the water and said, "You know, this was never about the kayaks." I nodded. "It was about who gets to say what the lake means," I said. And the lake finally said it for itself. We didn't need to add more. The silence was the agreement. At the next community potluck, held at a neighbor's garage, not the clubhouse, someone brought cupcakes decorated like lily pads. Another neighbor shared hand-painted bookmarks with tiny watercolor kayaks and heron silhouettes. One of the kids performed a short skit reenacting the Great Drain of 24, complete with a cardboard sash and dramatic feint. The crowd laughed until they cried. When it ended, the applause lasted longer than necessary. Not because of the performance, but because it was the kind of laughter that acknowledged something deeper. That we had survived something ridiculous, and that it had made us better. A week later, Greg formally announced that the HOA had voted to revise its charter. Not through a dramatic restructuring or legal battle, but through attrition and consensus. Most of the board had either stepped down or simply stopped showing up. The new document was 3 pages long. It defined the HOA as a caretaker, not a regulator. It recognized the lake as a shared resource under ecological stewardship, in coordination with the existing conservation agreement. The phrase "no brunch barges without permission" appeared as a footnote. I didn't attend the vote. I didn't need to. I was on the water with Walter and 2 kids paddling in a zigzag behind us, trying to race a pair of ducks. I watched their silhouettes against the blue. I listened to their laughter cutting across the ripples. I felt the quiet approval of something older than us all. That night, I lit a fire near the shore and sat with a journal on my lap. I wrote one line and underlined it twice. Balance isn't something you achieve. It's something you protect. As the flames settled and the stars reflected off the water, I felt peace. Not the fragile kind built on silence and rules, but the earned kind. The kind built on noise, conflict, restoration, and the long, strange dance of human folly and natural forgiveness. Silverthorne didn't belong to any of us, but it trusted us again, and that was enough.